In our backyard, my brother tore up months of my Chinese study materials, while I cried, scattering the pieces. He pointed at me and said, "When I tried to stand up for myself, starting tomorrow, in a diner you'll be spending your nights." At him, I just stared. 6 months ago, that was. He was standing in tears outside my apartment this morning. I was mocking his disability, my older brother said, by learning a second language, and his side our parents took. Growing up, my brother, Bryce, was this extremely happy kid always, with an extremely low IQ. About spelling his name wrong, he'd laugh and make fun of himself for taking Algebra 1 still in senior year, but then to even graduate, he failed. Suddenly, that intelligence was his enemy, he became convinced, and that anyone learning something was mocking him. These brain training games on our computer, our grandmother used to play, and right as she was hitting her high score, Bryce turned it off. Our 7-year-old cousin's Scrabble set that she got for Christmas he even binned after losing to her. And when Chinese I started learning to impress my crush, his next target I became. At first, I tried to be understanding. In front of him, I wouldn't practice, and watch the videos with headphones on, but enough that wasn't. My Duolingo notifications he'd heard and start breaking into tantrums, saying to make him feel stupid I was showing off. It was for a girl, I tried explaining, but my way of rubbing my working brain in his face, he insisted foreign languages were. Soon, parts of the house he started isolating. A Chinese-free zone became the living and dining rooms because that's where to decompress he needed to after his shift as the door opener at Kroger. A little annoyed I was, but moved everything to my bedroom, just. Door closed, headphones on. Surely, fine, this was now, and my Chinese I could practice in peace, right? Wrong. Before I knew it, my study sessions Bryce started documenting in a headache journal, claiming the Chinese coming through the walls triggered migraines. Pictures of himself holding his head he'd text Mom when I was practicing. I was using headphones, I told him, and just writing, not even speaking. But just knowing I'm mocking his disabilities, he said, was triggering. And because my parents' special little boy Bryce was, his side they took. Dad pulled me aside and said, "Challenges your brother has you'll never understand. Is some girl really worth making him feel worthless?" Even worse was Mom. Like I was torturing him on purpose, she acted, suggesting at the library I learn Chinese because first comes family, and will a few phrases really be the difference between her saying yes and getting rejected? I tried to stand my ground, but before I knew it, in our back garden I was sitting, learning Chinese because it was the only way Bryce felt included. But the garden I actually like. It was springtime, meaning warm it got, and the sound of wind made me focus better. But then from his job as door opener, Bryce got fired. It was the only job he had ever held. Into the back garden he stormed the day of and started tearing my printouts apart. To push him away I tried, but 6 inches taller and 5 years older he was, and to the ground he knocked me. He destroyed all my material on the spot right there. Still outside crying I was when inside the house I heard him arguing with Mom. "It's his fault, Mom, I lost the job. The joke I made at the Chinese customer was because of the Chinese he's learning." Mom hesitating, I saw, but then minutes later, out she was coming. "Bryce is right, honey. Your crush isn't worth destroying your brother's livelihood." In disbelief, I stared at her as down she knelt and helped me pick up what was left of my material. All forms of Chinese studying were now banned from our living area during Bryce's waking hours. "It's okay," Mom said. "From 5 to 6 a.m. before school you can practice. At 4:45 a.m. for the next 3 days, I remember waking up, sitting at the table, learning through my apps. Sleep-deprived I was, and my head hurt from staring at the screen in darkness. Lights on anywhere in the house before waking time triggered Bryce. And on day 4, a complete meltdown Bryce had at breakfast. Apparently, now just knowing I was learning Chinese while he slept gave him nightmares about being too stupid to exist. He demanded I leave the house entirely if to practice I wanted. "Go to that 24-hour diner if so much Chinese matters," he said. From their plate, my parents barely looked up. They were content to be just bystanders, I could tell. "Starting tomorrow, you'll be," Bryce was speaking as if determined it was already, "spending my nights in a diner." Mid-sentence, I cut him off. "Shut up. I'm not going." Like I had multiple heads, he stared at me. "What did you just... Do you have any idea why I'm learning Chinese?" I cut him off again. "Yeah, it's for that little crush of yours." "Not just that," I said. But this look I could tell made him skeptical. My voice I raised. "This was never about making you feel stupid, Bryce." "Yes, would you listen for once in your life?" For the 3rd time now, I interrupted. "Lynn's dad owns a gaming company," I said. Shaking my voice was. "He literally only hires family friends because them you trust more than random applications. You sit here every single night saying for a gaming job you'd kill, talking about how you know every game, every developer, every piece of industry news." Changing was Bryce's face. If I dated Lynn, at family dinners you'd be, at barbecues you'd be, her dad would meet you, see how passionate about gaming you are, and probably offer you something. But now, straight in the eyes I looked him. Now your name I'm never mentioning. And when about my family her dad asks, which he will, exactly what kind of person my brother is, I'm telling him. Someone who'd rather destroy my first relationship than let me be happy. Someone who his disability weaponizes to control everyone around him. Deafening was the silence. Mom's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and on her plate she put it back down. In her chair she shifted, and between me and Bryce looked before finally asking if what I said about the gaming company was true. Slow the words came out, like each one she was testing. Bryce didn't answer. He just pulled out his phone and started scrolling through one of his games, the one where you match colored blocks that for hours every night he played. Heavy his breathing got, and his hands gripping the phone so tight his knuckles went white, I could see. For the rest of dinner, nobody said anything. To bed I went that night thinking maybe through to them I'd finally gotten. The next morning, to find Bryce sitting on the floor outside my bedroom door, I woke up with that stupid headache journal in his lap. When I opened the door, he looked up and said he wanted to talk, but different his voice was, like asking he was instead of telling. Over him I stepped and downstairs headed, but he scrambled and me followed. As we went down the stairs he kept talking, saying all night he'd been up looking at the gaming company's website, junior game testers they were hiring, and a degree you didn't need, just passion and knowledge about games. His voice cracked when both of those things he said he had. To the kitchen I went, and a bowl from the cabinet, and the cereal from the pantry I grabbed. In the doorway Bryce stood, watching me pour the milk, waiting for me to say something. After everything for months he put me through, him suddenly wanting my help felt wrong. What his point was, I finally asked. A step into the kitchen he took, and the words seemed to hurt him when me to introduce him to Lynn's dad. He said he needed. Please, he actually said. Mom came into the kitchen then, and terrible she looked, with dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't slept either, she said, because about what I'd said about destroying my first relationship she kept thinking. To face both of them I turned while holding my cereal bowl. It wasn't just about the relationship, I told him, but about respect, because 16 I was, not 6, and deserved to pursue my interest without being sabotaged. His journal down on the counter, Bryce slammed so hard the salt shaker jumped. Fine, he shouted. The headaches were fake, and he'd made it all up because jealous he was. Even he looked surprised that out loud he'd said it. In the doorway, Dad appeared, already dressed in his work clothes with his tie up and briefcase in his hand. What Bryce just admitted he'd heard, he said, and that tonight we'd all be discussing this when from work he got home. Weird was the rest of that morning, with Bryce avoiding eye contact and Mom in complete silence making breakfast, while Dad for the office early had already left. My backpack I grabbed and to school headed, where Alexander I found standing by my locker, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, and the bags under my eyes immediately noticed. Everything about Bryce I told him, finally admitting he'd been faking the headaches and how Dad had actually heard him confess it. Alexander shook his head and asked if finally my parents would do something about it. While grabbing my history textbook, I shrugged, because honestly what would happen, I had no idea, but different Mom had seemed last night. Like maybe she was finally seeing what had been going on. To first period we were about to head when at my locker Lynn appeared, holding her Chinese workbook. She smiled and said she'd heard I was learning Chinese, which was really cool, and asked if at lunch I wanted to practice together. So hard my heart started pounding I thought she might hear it, but to nod I managed and tell her that I'd like that. Alexander grinned and some excuse made about needing to get to class early before walking away to give us space. Exactly what I'd been working toward this was. All those mornings studying in the dark and all those hours in the garden before Bryce my materials destroyed. For another minute, Lynn and I talked about which apps we were using before the warning bell rang, and for class we had to split up. The whole day dragged on with me barely able to focus on anything except lunch with Lynn and whatever for tonight Dad had planned. When that evening I finally got home, Dad was already there, with his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up, sitting in the living room with Mom and Bryce. Why Bryce thought his joke about Chinese customers was connected to his brother learning the language. So strange that jump in logic is, like for anything to blame except himself he's looking. The room that Bryce's Chinese-free zone used to be now felt like a courtroom, with Dad sitting forward in his chair, looking more serious than him I'd ever seen. He started by saying that Bryce to faking his symptoms had admitted, which was manipulation and abuse. the word abuse in the air hung like something toxic because in our family before, we'd never used that word. Bryce's face turned red, and from the couch he jumped up, yelling that he was the one with the disability and he was the one who couldn't learn things like I could, while at me, pointing like the criminal, here I was. Mom finally spoke up in this quiet voice, saying that a disability didn't give him the right to control others, and that him she thought she'd been enabling. The bitter laugh that escaped I couldn't help when I reminded her she'd made me study Chinese at 5 in the morning in complete darkness because Bryce claimed about it he was having nightmares. 3 days later, completely quiet, Bryce had gone and spent most of his time locked in his room with his laptop, which was weird because TV he usually watched in the living room from morning to night. Him meals on a tray Mom would bring, but the whole cutting his food into bite-sized pieces thing, she wasn't doing anymore. Just the plate by his door left and walked away. Him typing away at all hours I could hear, printing stuff out on our old printer that this awful grinding noise made every time a page it spit out. At school, Lynn and I, to meet up during lunch, had started to practice Chinese together, sitting under the big oak tree behind the cafeteria where really nobody went. These flashcards her mom had made she'd bring, and each other we'd quiz while eating our sandwiches. And way better than me she was, but about it never made me feel dumb. One day, her dad was looking for game testers for their new project, she mentioned, asking if anyone I knew was really passionate about gaming. I froze with my sandwich halfway to my mouth because someone, of course, I knew, but part of me wanted to say no, to punish Bryce wanted for everything he'd put me through. But then about what it could mean for our family, I thought, if a job he cared about he actually got, how maybe things could change. That Friday night after dinner, to my room I was heading when in the hallway Bryce cornered me, shoving this thick stack of papers at me that hours putting together he'd clearly spent. The portfolio had every single game Miller Interactive had ever made, with detailed analysis, screenshots he printed in color, even though Mom always yelled about ink costs, and these long paragraphs about game mechanics and story development. Through page after page I flipped, shocked at how good it actually was. How things about the games he noticed I never even thought about, despite playing some of them myself. There he stood watching me read, from foot to foot shifting his weight like a little kid waiting for test results. When at him I looked up, he said quietly that about everything he wasn't stupid, just most things. And the most vulnerable I had ever seen him in my entire life it was. The next week, to Lynn, I finally mentioned Bryce while we were practicing, carefully telling her my brother was obsessed with her dad's games and actually more about them knew than anyone I had ever met. Immediately she perked up, saying her dad loved meeting true fans and maybe to their weekend barbecue Bryce could come. When I got home and Bryce about the invitation told, his eyes actually filled with tears, and if I was really doing this for him he kept asking, after everything that had happened. I was doing it, I told him, because the right thing to do it was, but made it clear that if he embarrassed me or any comments made about Chinese people, done forever we were. And so hard he nodded I thought his head might fall off. The day of the barbecue came way faster than I expected, and Bryce the entire morning in his room spent trying on different shirts. Through the wall I could hear him practicing conversation starters with Mom. To just relax and be himself, we kept telling him. His nicest jeans she helped him pick out, and even his favorite gaming shirt ironed that some retro controller design had on it. Almost 3 hours they spent going over topics he could talk about if awkward the conversation got. When in the car we finally got to drive to Lynn's house, so bad Bryce's hands were shaking he couldn't even buckle his seatbelt properly. The whole ride there, what if questions he kept asking me about messing up or saying something dumb. We pulled up to this huge house with perfect grass and a 3-car garage, and in the passenger seat Bryce just froze. Out of the car he wouldn't get for like 5 whole minutes and kept saying, maybe a bad idea this was. His usual confidence where everyone he'd boss around was completely gone, and like a scared little kid he looked. I told him to just be the version of himself who loves games, not the version who homework tears up. He nodded and finally got out, but shaking his legs whereas up the driveway we walked. Lynn answered the door with this huge smile and through to the backyard, led us where her dad was grilling burgers. Mr. Johnson turned around with this warm smile and both our hands shook like important business partners or something we were. The second Bryce mentioned he'd beaten every achievement in their latest game, Mr. Johnson's whole face lit up. He started asking Bryce about specific mechanics and boss fights, and alive Bryce just came, talking about frame rates and difficulty curves. All that stuttering and nervousness disappeared as his strategy he explained for the final boss that apparently only 2% of players had beaten, Leaning in, Mr. Johnson was, asking follow-up questions, and even over some other guy who worked at the company called to hear Bryce's analysis. For like an hour straight, they stood there just talking about game design and player retention rates and stuff I didn't even understand. My hand Lynn grabbed and we went to get food while by the grill they kept talking. 2 hours into the party, across the yard I looked, and Bryce was still deep in conversation with Mr. Johnson and 2 other employees. Lynn squeezed my hand and said my brother really knew his stuff, which made me feel weird because anyone compliment him before I'd never heard. We stayed until almost 9, and when we got home, in the living room, Mom was waiting, asking how it went. Bryce couldn't stop talking about how Mr. Johnson wanted to see his portfolio of game reviews he'd been writing. Mom actually started crying on the phone when later that evening she called, saying this happy Bryce hadn't been in years. She kept thanking me for giving him this chance and saying maybe for our family things could finally turn around. This weird mix of being happy for him I felt, but also still mad about all the months of hell he put me through. He needed to earn this opportunity, I told her, and that one good day what he did to me didn't erase. Quiet she got and said she understood, but I could tell she just wanted everything to go back to normal. The next morning, barely awake I was when into my room Bryce burst without even knocking, his phone he was holding and practically jumping up and down, saying Mr. Johnson had emailed him about taking a real test, not just a conversation, but an actual game knowledge test that to an internship at the company could lead. His excitement was so intense, I thought from not breathing properly between words he might pass out. That was great, I told him, but made sure to remind him this all came through my relationship with Lynn, the relationship he tried to destroy when he ripped up my Chinese homework and got me banned from studying in my own house. His face from pure joy went to something on him I'd never seen before. Like for the first time, actual shame was hitting him. He sat down on the couch and his head in his hands put. Stayed quiet for maybe 30 seconds, which was the longest without talking I'd ever seen him go. When he looked up, wet his eyes were, and he asked me how things right he could make. An answer ready I didn't have because honestly, I never expected him to care about making anything right. Over the next week, in our house, something weird happened. Bryce started studying for that test, like on it his life depended, but not in his usual way where with him everyone had to suffer. He wore headphones, kept normal hours, didn't demand we all be silent when he was working. At the kitchen table, he'd set up with his laptop and notebooks, writing down everything he knew about different game studios and their histories. Snacks and drinks Mom kept bringing him, but he'd just nod and keep working, not making a big deal about needing special treatment. Dad noticed it first, pulled me aside one evening while Bryce was in his room reviewing his notes. It was like having a different son, he told me, and that years ago he should have stepped in instead of letting things get so bad. The apology felt weird coming from him after all this time, but I could see he meant it. 3 days before the test, nervous Bryce started getting, pacing around the house and asking me questions about what Mr. Johnson might ask him. The morning of the test, twice before breakfast, he threw up. Couldn't keep anything down, hands shaking so bad, his shirt for him Mom had to button. He kept asking what would happen if he failed, if even for this chance he was too stupid. He wasn't stupid about games, I told him, that Mr. Johnson had seen that already, and to just trust what he knew. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth after everything he'd put me through, but them I meant. He left for the test, looking like he might pass out but determined. The next 2 weeks waiting for results were the strangest our family had ever been. Bryce was anxious, but about it not mean. On anyone, didn't take it out. Just his email every 10 minutes kept refreshing. Bryce spent 3 hours practicing conversation topics with their mom before the barbecue. Such careful preparation that is for someone who usually just demands things. How did his brain switch from memorizing game details to remembering social rules? Mom supported him without babying him for once, telling him whatever happened, they were proud he tried. Dad actually sat at dinner with us and about everyone's day asked instead of hiding in his office. At school, good things were too. Lynn and I were officially together, and it everyone knew. Alexander kept joking that into a relationship strategy I'd turned family dysfunction, but completely wrong about that he wasn't. Lynn thought the whole situation with Bryce was crazy, but glad she was something good might come from it. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled me aside between classes one day, said my teachers had noticed happier I seemed lately and wanted to check if at home everything was okay. Worried about me she'd been since sophomore year when exhausted to school I'd shown up from those early morning study sessions. Things were actually getting better, I told her, and genuinely relieved she looked. 2 weeks and 3 days after the test, at dinner we were all when Bryce's phone buzzed. So fast he grabbed it he knocked over his water glass, hands shaking worse than test day. He tried to open the email but he couldn't manage. The phone at Mom he shoved and asked her to read it. She opened it and out loud started reading about how pleased they were to offer him a position in their game testing department. Bryce completely lost it. Harder than I'd seen since he was maybe 8 years old, started sobbing. He kept saying he got it, that for his brain someone actually wanted him, not despite it. Crying too, Mom was. Dad got up and him actually hugged, which in years I hadn't seen. Even I felt something in my chest watching him realize to someone who wasn't family he was worth something. Dad went straight to the kitchen and back with a bottle of champagne we've been saving since New Year's. Right there in the living room, popping it while Mom kept wiping tears from her face and Bryce into these tight hugs pulling every few minutes. Bryce sat on the couch, reading that offer letter again and again, his finger tracing each line like he was scared if he looked away the words might change. And the salary number I watched him mouth at least 20 times before Dad poured everyone a glass, even me half of one giving. The whole thing felt like watching a different family, like aliens had replaced the people I'd lived with for years, because Dad was actually talking about Bryce's future and Mom was making plans for his first day instead of just worrying about his feelings. We stayed up until almost midnight talking about the job, about gaming, about everything except Chinese or disabilities or any of the stuff that for months had torn us apart. Around 11 that night, already in bed I was when the knock on my door I heard. Soft at first, then a bit louder, and when I opened it Bryce was standing there looking more uncomfortable than him I'd ever seen, shifting his weight and at the floor staring. He started talking fast, saying of everything about me he'd been jealous, not just the Chinese, but how stuff I learned without trying, made friends without thinking about it, did all the things that for him felt impossible. His voice cracked when he admitted he wanted to punish me for being everything he couldn't be, for having the brain that worked right, for making him feel broken just by existing. I told him I knew that months ago I'd figured it out, but knowing why didn't make it okay, that my life he'd made hell, destroyed my stuff, gotten me kicked out of my own house at 5 in the morning. He nodded and his phone pulled out, showing me a shopping cart full of Chinese learning books and apps he'd been researching, saying his first paycheck he wanted to use to replace everything he destroyed, and maybe some basic phrases for work I could teach him, since there might be Chinese clients. The next 2 weeks passed in this weird adjustment period where Bryce would practice saying hello and thank you in Chinese while getting ready for work, wearing his new, more interactive t-shirt around the house like of gold it was made. Mom started telling him no for the first time I could remember. Like, when his first team meeting he wanted to skip, go anyway, she made him. And Dad actually stayed in the room during family dinners instead of to his office disappearing. Everything felt different but fragile, like how to be a family again we were all learning. And when Alexander came over 3 weeks later, in the doorway he stopped and looked around like into the wrong house he'd walked. The place felt different, he kept saying, lighter somehow, like everyone could finally breathe without worrying about setting off a bomb. And he even pointed out that my Chinese homework at the kitchen table I was doing, instead of hiding. Things were going well until about a month into the job when early one Tuesday Bryce came home, looking like someone had died, his face white and his hands shaking as he told us a huge mistake in testing he'd made that might get him fired. A major bug he'd missed because to his team lead, he'd been showing off about knowing some obscure game mechanic, got distracted and approved something that crashed the whole system, costing them hours of work. But instead of throwing things or screaming or blaming me somehow, at the table he sat and asked what he should do, how he could fix, how he could show them from mistakes he could learn, instead of just being the stupid kid who broke everything. My laptop I grabbed and next to him at the kitchen table sat, something that just months ago would have been impossible. We spent the next hour typing and retyping his email to his supervisor, me showing him how to take responsibility without sounding pathetic, how to propose solutions instead of just apologizing. His hands were shaking as he typed, but he kept going, asking me to check his spelling, his tone, if too stupid he sounded. When send he finally hit, at the screen he stared like he was waiting for the world to end. The next morning, his supervisor called while I was eating breakfast, and on speaker Bryce put it without asking, his face white as paper. Mr. Smith's voice filled our kitchen, and Bryce's jaw drop I watched when instead of firing him, the man said he was impressed that Bryce's mistake owned and with solutions came, that most people just make excuses, that real growth this showed. After the call ended, Bryce just sat there stunned, and I realized something between us had changed, that he wasn't the brother who my stuff destroyed anymore, but someone who my help actually needed and could accept it without making it about his disability. 2 months passed like that. Him asking for help with work emails, me teaching him basic professional stuff, both of us not talking about how weird this reversal was. Then at Sunday dinner, while dessert Mom was serving, Bryce cleared his throat and announced to move out he'd been saving money. Mom's fork on her plate clattered, and Dad's coffee mug halfway to his mouth stopped. Bryce kept talking, explaining a studio apartment near work he'd found with 2 roommates who also worked in gaming. Guys who about his IQ scores didn't care or that he never graduated, just that every game ever made he knew. Mom started crying, but not the angry tears I expected. More like her baby bird leave the nest 20 years late she was watching. Over the next few weeks, his stuff together we packed up, going through boxes of old games and toys, finding things we'd forgotten existed. Our old Dark Souls disc he held up and asked if I remembered helping him beat that one boss, back before everything went bad, back when just brothers who played games together we were. I remembered. We both did. The invitation to Lynn's family's annual company party came addressed to all of us, but this time, as an employee Bryce would be attending, not just as my brother tagging along. The night of the party, him practice his presentation about game testing in front of the bathroom mirror I watched, stumbling over words but determined to get through it. At the actual party, in front of 50 people he stood, including Mr. Johnson, and started talking about bug detection, shaking his voice at first, but then its rhythm finding as he explained how his different way of thinking helped him catch things other testers missed, beaming like a proud father Mr. Johnson was. And afterwards, Mr. Williams, the head of testing, pulled me aside to tell me my brother had unique insights, that his perspective was actually an asset because games he approached differently than everyone else. The whole drive home, Bryce kept talking about the different bugs in games he'd noticed over the years and how maybe it's something he could actually be good. And for the first time in forever, Mom and Dad were listening to him like an adult he was instead of their broken child. 3 weeks later, in Bryce's room on moving day, we were standing, wrapping his gaming posters in bubble wrap while he sorted through old controllers and headsets he'd collected over the years. The apartment he found was only 20 minutes away, but like to another country he was moving it felt, and Mom kept stopping to wipe her eyes every time another box she picked up. She finally broke down completely when the truck we were loading, sobbing into Dad's shoulder while saying him too long she'd babied and thought him she was protecting. But really, all these years she'd been holding him back. That's when Bryce's new roommates pulled up in a beat-up Honda, 2 guys from the gaming company who'd offered to share their place when they heard he was looking, and immediately with him they started joking about which console was superior while grabbing boxes like him forever they'd known. I watched them treat him like just another 20-something guy moving in with friends, not someone with a disability or special needs, just Bryce, who happened to be really good at finding bugs in games. As we finished loading everything and Bryce was about to get in the car, me aside he pulled and an envelope into my hand pressed, looking down at his shoes while telling me not to open it until he was gone. The transformation from Bryce destroying Chinese books to actually buying replacements with his first paycheck shows such a complete flip in how he sees his brother. The house felt wrong that night at dinner with his empty chair still at the table, like someone had died, except him we could still text. And Mom kept starting to call him for dinner before herself catching. After to bed they went. In my room I finally opened the envelope and found $300 in cash, along with a note written in his messy handwriting that said the disabled one he was, but me he disabled too, and he was sorry, and could I maybe teach him some Chinese when settled he got. My hands were shaking as I read 3 times and folded it carefully, and in my desk drawer with my old Chinese materials put it. A week later, he called while homework I was doing, practically yelling into the phone about how spaghetti for the first time he cooked, and terrible it was and stuck to the pot, but his terrible spaghetti it was that himself he made without anyone helping. Lynn and I went to visit him the next weekend, and around the apartment he showed us like it was a palace, pointing out his corner with his gaming setup, in the kitchen where the spaghetti he'd burned, in his bedroom that already a disaster of clothes and game boxes was. His roommates were there playing some new release, and one of them looked up and said, I was the brother who the connection got him, and thanks because Bryce was actually cool and had already found 3 major bugs in testing they'd missed. We all ended up playing together for hours, passing controllers around and arguing about strategies. And Bryce wasn't trying to control everything or prove he was smarter, just sharing what he knew and actually listening when a different approach to a boss fight Lynn suggested. This was who all along he could have been if we hadn't all been so focused on what he couldn't do instead of what he could. If Mom and Dad hadn't wrapped him in bubble wrap and told him too hard for him to navigate alone the world was. 2 weeks after that, Mom and Dad went to visit him for dinner and home came looking 10 years younger, going on and on about how chicken he'd cooked them that was only slightly burned and had shown them his pay stub from his first real paycheck, and how his roommates had said, one of the best testers testers on the team he was already. Chinese right in the living room. I started practicing after that visit. My textbooks spread across the coffee table while Mom, her magazine on the couch, read nearby. Nobody complained or made faces or claimed migraines anymore. Sometimes I'd video call Bryce in the evenings, and he'd ask me to teach him basic phrases, sitting in his tiny apartment kitchen with his roommate's cat wandering through the background. He was terrible at tones and kept mixing up simple words, but at his mistakes he'd laugh and try again, writing notes in his messy handwriting. At school the next week, by Mrs. Rodriguez's office, I stopped and told her everything that had happened since the court stuff. Back in her chair, she leaned and said something about people needing to hit bottom before they could change, and how our family a way through had found. 3 months passed like that, with Bryce getting better at his job every week, until one Thursday evening, my phone rang while I was doing homework. It was Bryce, and so hard he was crying I could barely understand him at first. But then he managed to get out that to senior tester he had been promoted. His voice cracked when he said they valued his brain, his different brain that noticed things other testers missed. That Sunday, we started what became our new tradition, with everyone gathering at our house for dinner. Bryce drove himself over in the used Honda he bought with his own money, walking through the door with this confidence I'd never seen before. We ate Mom's lasagna and talked about normal stuff like work and school and the weather. During dinner, Bryce cleared his throat and announced in online classes he'd enrolled. Just basic stuff, he said, wanting to try learning again at his own pace. Dad stood up with his glass and the short toast made about second chances and new beginnings. We all raised our glasses, even Bryce with his apple juice, since champagne he never did like, or any alcohol really. Lynn showed up for dessert, bringing homemade cookies she baked with her mom. Bryce thanked her in Chinese, the pronunciation butchering completely, but with real sincerity saying it. She smiled and his tones gently corrected, and at himself he laughed without any of that old shame or anger. While Mom was cutting the pie, Bryce admitted the classes he might fail, but wanted to try anyway because the worst thing anymore failing wasn't. Not trying was. As everyone got ready to leave and Lynn helped Mom with dishes, near the front door Bryce pulled me aside. He looked at me for a long moment, then said simply that for the chance he was grateful, for my patience, for not giving up on him completely, even when at his worst he'd been. I watched him drive away to his own life a few minutes later while Mom and Dad waved from the doorway like proud parents should. The house felt peaceful now in a way it never had before. In the living room, I sat down to practice my Chinese characters while my parents read nearby, nobody claiming territories or keeping journals of grievances or demanding anyone leave. We were still figuring out how to be a family without all the old toxic dynamics, but together we were learning, making mistakes, and trying again, just like Bryce with his Chinese phrases, building something better one day at a time. Man, hanging out and just exploring all this with you today, I had a blast. Seriously, such a fun ride it's been. To do it again soon, can't wait.